Russians can still come on holiday to the United Kingdom and EU countries. Yes, you heard that right. Citizens from the same country engaged in a full-scale invasion of a European neighbour are still being granted access to the UK and EU. In 2025, the EU issued 620,000 visas to Russian nationals, an increase of over 10% compared to the previous year. More than 477,000 of them were tourist visas. Visits to family and friends were the second most common category, followed by business trips. France, Italy and Spain accounted for around 3/4 of all visa applications submitted by Russian nationals. France has seen the sharpest increase in granting Russian citizens visas, with a jump of more than 29% in 2025 compared to 2024. At the same time, the United Kingdom granted more than 45,000 visitor visas to Russian citizens in the year ending December 2025. The approval rate for these visas is around 93%. So obviously, the question becomes, why on earth are European governments still allowing large numbers of Russian nationals to enter Western countries while Russia continues invading Ukraine? Now, some EU politicians have argued we shouldn't isolate Russian civil society, but I disagree completely. Russians need to understand that if their leadership engages in a full-scale invasion of another society, they will suffer. Russian civil society needs to be pressured so they in turn pressure their government. But I would argue it's not just about pressuring Russians. European governments and NATO officials have openly acknowledged Russia is conducting hybrid warfare against Europe, including sabotage, cyber attacks, and disinformation campaigns. Britain itself has already experienced this directly. For example, in 2018, Russian intelligence officers flew to London from Moscow under civilian cover, travelled to Salisbury, and attempted to kill a former Russian spy using chemical weapons. During the same attack, the Kremlin assassins killed an innocent British woman. European countries should also expect these kinds of hybrid operations to continue. According to a paper published by the Royal United Services Institute, millions of young Russians are trained in pro-Kremlin youth organizations, where sabotage is framed as part of preparation for conflict with NATO. Therefore, it seems quite spectacularly stupid that European governments are granting visas to individuals that pose a threat to our societies. Some EU politicians have voiced concerns about Russians entering Europe, specifically Russians returning from their invasion of Ukraine. For example, one EU official previously warned that Russian military veterans returning from Ukraine could pose a criminal and security threat to Europe. Reports from Russian media echo this claim, with an article highlighting former soldiers murdering Russian civilians upon returning. So, Putin could start pushing unstable veterans into Europe to cause chaos. Now, it's worth noting that the EU has already tightened restrictions on Russian travellers. The EU suspended its visa facilitation agreement with Russia, making visas more expensive, slower to process, and subject to greater scrutiny. Additionally, the EU has moved away from issuing multi-entry visas for most Russian nationals, meaning Russians must now reapply each time they want to enter the Schengen area. European officials have also begun debating whether former Russian soldiers returning from the war in Ukraine should be prevented from entering Europe altogether. In the United Kingdom, similar to many other European countries, tighter restrictions apply to Russian travellers. However, unlike European countries, Russians entering the United Kingdom can enter multiple times on the same visa. Overall, Russians can't just walk into the UK or EU, but it is obvious that Russians pose a threat to Western societies. Therefore, issuing hundreds of thousands or tens of thousands of visas is an incredibly risky thing to do.